Continuing our unit on theater, focusing on opera, musical theater, ballet. Here we are in the Romantic period, 1820 to 1900, and then we're talking about the late Romantic period. So it's a sub-style, they call it post-Romanticism. And then this style of Verismo, and the composer we're going to sample is Giacomo, spelled it wrong, 1C, Puccini, 1858, 1924. So obviously this is in the second half of the 19th century, all the way he lived into 1924, the 20th century, early modernism. So remember, we sampled music by Monteverdi, Orfeo, Dido Aeneas, Henry Purcell, Mozart's Don Giovanni, Verdi's Rigoletto, Wagner's opera, and here we are with the Verismo. Styles have changed, and really the Romantic period starts with Beethoven. And styles change, they don't get better, they just change. At the turn of the 20th century, an important movement called post-Romanticism reflected an expansion and intensification of late Romantic trends, especially in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Italian composer Giacomo Puccini wrote some of the best love operas of all time, including his opera Madame Butterfly, which combines two end-of-the-century trends, Verismo, which is an example of realism, and exoticism. We've used that word a number of times, focused here on Japanese culture and music. Very popular and different mediums, not just music. People were curious about Asian culture. Other composers that were in this style, Richard Strauss, we're not going to sample any of his music, but he's a very important composer, part of a music family, the Strausses. Gustav Mahler wrote some beautiful music, and he was Viennese. So what is Verismo? It's about subjects from everyday life. You know, we listen to the Don Giovanni or Rigoletto, and they're about people of high status and that are wealthy, and dukes, and these types of status of people. And Verismo is more about you and me kind of a subject matter. And it's treated and down to earth. And sometimes things hurt in real life. And so this is like the subject matter. And it's curious that as soon as film starts to be produced, and it does around this time, if Puccini lived till 1924, they take on this, they don't call it Verismo, but it's certainly a lot of realism in the movies that are made at this time. As an example of exoticism by a painter, no association to the music we're going to sample. But Claude Monet was an impressionist in France. And so this is an example of exoticism. Puccini. With a name like Puccini, it has to be Italian. Son of a church organist. It's so often that wonderful composers or musicians are from a music family. And maybe you ask, why is that? And I think a lot of people have music talent that's never fully developed. And so if you have a parent that has gone through the whole process and knows how to solve music problems and become an accomplished musician, and then they see talent in their child, and so they say, well, gee, I will help them because I know how to become a professional musician, and they do. And so it sets this type of an individual to have a career in music and fully develop their music talents. Again, there's no shortage of talent. There just isn't. But some people are successful with their talent and other people just enjoy it and are successful in other areas. So we've used that term bel canto, and we will hear that in the example of music, bel canto, soaring melodies, rich orchestral timbres, and he uses leitmotifs. Remember when you have a melody that represents a person, place, or thing? And he wrote 12 operas and other types of music, orchestral, chamber, solo, piano works. Here he is, Mr. Puccini, 1858, 1924. Very successful throughout the whole world. His music is played today. His opera, Madame Butterfly, he saw a play by the same name, and it had inspired him to make the opera. Again, verismo and exoticism in this opera. Here's a print of Asian culture, and of course their dress style is different than ours. In the opera, one of the main characters is a geisha, and there was a movie made recently from Hollywood that was about geisha girls, and it's a career, you might say, for women to become a geisha, and it's a status of life, and it's a respected status. These are women that are not prostitutes. They are educated, and they are a paid date for a man, and this still goes on apparently in Japan. They would prepare to be able to carry on a conversation with the person they were going to be with, whether it was politics or science, and they were not prostitutes. They were entertainment for a man. It may lead to sex and may not. So here in the Madame Butterfly opera, and of course, it's not too far off the mark because American Navy personnel were all over the world and a lot in Japan. The story is Pinkerton, who was a naval officer, falls in love with a geisha, Chow Chow San. They get married, they have a child. Well, he doesn't know that they have a child, according to the story, but he's on duty with the Navy and he leaves. He promises that he will come back. So she is awaiting for him to come back patiently, right? And she loves this man. And he does come back, but he comes back with his American wife and finds out that Chow Chow has a child now. That was the father was Pinkerton. Pinkerton and his new wife decide that it's best to take the child back to the U.S. Chow Chow agrees to this. But as the ship leaves the harbor, she commits hara-kiri. You've heard that word, right? She takes her own life. She falls on the sword. Well, that's the storyline. It's very sad, and it's poignant, and people can relate to this. But this is all true stuff, and I'm sure it happened like this in people's lives. Exoticism in the music, whole tone and pentatonic scales. Normal scale would be like this. And a whole tone scale would. So using that scale and then pentatonic scales add an Asian element to the opera. So the piece of music we're going to hear from the opera Madame Butterfly is Act 2, and this was actually made in 1904. It's called Un Bel Dì, One Beautiful Day. And so she is singing to her assistant about imagining when Pinkerton returns. It's a very famous melody, and this is bel canto singing, our listening guide. Here is our music example, Un Bel Dì from Madame Butterfly, composed by Giacomo Puccini.
Io
a review of terms post-romanticism, a trend at the turn of the 20th century in which 19th century musical characteristics like chromatic harmony and expansive melodies are carried to the extreme. Exoticism, musical style in which rhythms, melodies, or instruments evoke the color and atmosphere of far-off lands. Verismo, operatic realism, a style popular in Italy in the 1890s, which tried to bring naturalism into the lyric theater. Pentatonic scale, dee da 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 da. Five-note pattern used in some African, Far Eastern, and Native American musics can also be found in Western music as an example of exoticism. The whole tone scale, I gave you an example of that. The thing is that normal, or I say normal, the scales that we talk about, major and minor scales, are combinations of whole steps and half steps. Remember, a whole step is when you go from C to D on the piano, two white keys. If you have a black key in between, the black key to the white key is a half step. A scale is made up of combinations of whole steps and half steps in a particular order to give it a particular sound. The order is different in a minor scale than it is a whole tone scale. And then we have a formula for a pentatonic scale, and we have a formula for a whole tone scale. And what it does, just uses whole tones. A gap scale, a scale that lacks some pitches of the 7-note diatonic scale. For example, a 5-note pentatonic scale has gaps. In other words, it doesn't use all of the notes. It only has 5 instead of 7. Diatonic means that it's a scale that has combinations of whole steps and half steps, sometimes 1.5 steps. But it's a particular formula that makes it have its sound, and it's that arrangement of whole steps, half steps. That will end our discussion, chapter 47, Exotic Allure, Puccini and the Italian Verismo tradition.